Thank you so much, Dan and Anna, for having me. Thanks to all of you for being here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation this evening about books. And for the uninitiated, you might think about books as the transcript of a podcast that's like 12 hours long, or 50 Substack posts that have been printed out and stapled together. I'll be talking about the kind of the practicalities and logistics of writing books and transitioning from writing primarily articles to primarily books, or at least incorporating books in your portfolio of work and income. And I'll just start with my standard disclaimer, which is that really nobody knows anything about how publishing works. So take everything I say tonight with a healthy dose of salt. Maybe if Michael Pollan or Mary Roach were here, they would actually understand this industry. You're stuck with me, and I'll tell you that I find publishing incredibly opaque. I'm certainly not the only writer who feels that way. The industry is famously secretive about what it pays authors and how many units it sells and so on. Publishing is also incredibly cyclic. 5 to 10 years ago, I think you would have said it was a kind of a great time to be writing environmental nonfiction. Now I think it's a bad time to be writing anything that is not celebrity memoir or romantasy. Just because everything I'm telling you tonight may not be true in 2 to 3 years. And then finally, I'll say, of course, every writer is different. Every writer's experience is different. That's, of course, true of all forms of media, but I think it's especially true of book writing for a couple of reasons. Of course, the scale of books magnifies difference, right? If you're a disorganized versus an organized writer at the scale of a 5,000-word magazine feature, you're really in trouble when you write an 80,000-word book. And of course, books also create opportunities for other kinds of difference, by which I mean if you're a naturally gregarious person, the thought of going on lots of podcasts and doing in-person events to promote your book might seem very pleasurable, whereas if you're naturally a hermit, it might sound like torture. So books create other types of difference, and everything I say tonight, again, is my own personal experience, and if you were hearing a presentation from a different author, you'd probably be hearing different words of questionable wisdom. So those are my standard caveats. There we go. Okay, so why should you write a book? Why might one want to undertake this arduous, years-long endeavor? What is the point? And I'll just say a few reasons. One is that some stories simply deserve it because of their narrative complexity, their thematic richness. Maybe they unfold over very long chronologies or over many different settings. There are stories that simply can't be told properly, I think, except in the format of a book. I think about the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks, for example, as a story that is so rich and nuanced and layered and complex with so much intergenerational interplay that it just required a book. And some stories are like that. Books generate opportunities, professional opportunities, like teaching. Of course, it's a great feather in your cap if you want to teach. Public speaking, that's become a much bigger part of my life than I ever thought it would, doing conference keynotes and presenting to environmental groups and library groups and so on. So books are generators of opportunity. They also cost you opportunity, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And then finally, I think that books are just fundamentally important. They're vital to our culture. Of course, all forms of media are important. Obviously, hardcore investigative magazine journalism and newspaper journalism and podcast journalism is also vital. But I think that books have the power not only to shift law and policy as investigative magazine reporting does, but also the power and the weight to shift culture. Where would the environmental movement be without Silent Spring or the end of nature, right? Books are these physical artifacts that live on people's shelves over really long spans of time. They insidiously insert themselves into people's thought patterns and change minds over a really long time scale. And that's why I've always found books really powerful, and that's why they're my favorite medium in which to work. And then I think that finally the biggest reason to write a book that, again, many writers might take exception with, but I think it's fun. I actually mean that. I enjoy book writing more than any other form of writing for a few reasons. First, you can satiate your curiosity, right? When you're writing against a 1,500-word newspaper word count, if you discover some interesting tangent or rabbit hole, too bad, you can't follow it. Whereas, when you have 80,000 words to play with, of course, you can't include everything, but you can certainly follow those little curious threads wherever they lead you. You can develop expertise. Whenever I am working on magazine stories, I feel a little bit like a dilettante. You spend 2 to 3 weeks, let's say, learning everything there is to know about X, and you file that story, and then you're on to Y, and a whole new realm of knowledge enters your head and pushes out everything that came before it. Of course, writers who work on beats over sustained periods of time become experts in their beats as well, but I just love the experience of essentially getting if not quite a PhD, at least a master's, essentially, in whatever you're writing a book about. So I love that feeling of being something of an expert in the topics of my books. And then finally, I think you can write like yourself when you're working on a book in a way that you can't. Of course, every publication has a house style, right? If I took a New Yorker story and printed it out and gave it to Dan and said, "Where was this story published?" Dan would say that was in the New Yorker, not because of all the umlauts, but for reasons of house style as well. And when you write a book, of course you have an editor, but you're not writing to cohere to any kind of house style, and you can truly, as the kind of writerly cliche goes, find your voice, right? Sound like yourself on the page in the way that you don't anywhere else. Why shouldn't you write a book? And this is an equally long list. But certainly the economics of authorship are dubious, and we'll talk more in a moment about how you get paid when you write a book. But suffice to say that it's a really challenging pay structure, especially for debut authors who don't have much of a track record and whose advances are likely to be smaller. The opportunity cost is really high, right? And that's an economics term that basically means that every minute you spend writing a book is a minute that you're not pitching the New Yorker, right? I think if your goal was to be a great magazine writer, I'm not sure that writing books is the best way to get there. I think that doing magazine stories is the best way to get there. I have a list of stories that I've wanted to do for years, dozens and dozens of stories that I have never pitched and probably will never pitch because that time is occupied with book writing. And the heartbreak potential is pretty high too. When you spend a couple of weeks working on a magazine or digital piece and it gets published and nobody reads it, well, okay, too bad. We're on to the next thing, right? If you spend years pouring your heart and soul into this work that is basically your Horcrux, and you put it out there, and then nobody reads it or reads it and leaves you a series of nasty 1-star Goodreads reviews, that's potentially soul-crushing, right? And I certainly know, lots of writers who just haven't gone down the book road because they fear the emotional repercussions, which are real. So where do books come from? How do these objects enter the world? And I think in my experience, they come from a couple of places. One is individual magazine stories, right? John Krakauer goes out looking for Chris McCandless and for Outside Magazine and realizes there's a much bigger story there, and that story expands into a book. And then the other, the other place that I think they come from, at least for magazine writers, is sustained engagement on a single beat, right? I mean, for me personally, I've spent years writing about conservation biology and habitat connectivity and wildlife migration, over those many years, the topic of roads and their fragmentary impacts on nature just came up again and again and again until I finally felt like, there's actually a bigger story here about the impacts of our transportation infrastructure on nature. So there was no one individual story that was the germ of that book. It was just, working on a beat for many years over time. So when you have an idea, how do you know whether it's potentially book worthy? Because of course, again, books are this incredibly arduous, years long endeavor. Why? How do you know whether a concept can sustain that? And I think that one great way of conceptualizing that it is. Are there themes as well as narratives? And by that, and this is actually an idea for years ago, I interviewed Brooke Jarvis for the Open Notebook, and Brooke was talking about magazine stories, but I think it applies triply for books. Brooke basically said that every story is really two stories. There's the plot story, the narrative story, right? What is happening? Who are the characters? What are they doing? And then there's a kind of an idea story, as Brooke put it. Maybe that's the concept of shifting baseline syndrome, our creeping ecological amnesia. But there has to be some kind of big idea behind the narrative, the kind of tick-tock of the book itself. Thinking about my own work, Anna mentioned I wrote a book about beavers, right? And there's a plot story there, which is that there used to be a lot of beavers. We wiped them all out and changed the landscape, and now we're reintroducing them for their climate change mitigation and adaptation benefits. But there's a bigger idea story there as well, I think, which is beavers challenge our concepts of human supremacy and dominion over nature. And that was why I felt like that the topic of beavers was book worthy, because it felt like it had some big ideas behind it about the history of American capitalism and about our relationship with other species, as well as the on-the-ground work that beaver restorers are doing. And then I think the biggest question you have to ask yourself is whether your book idea thrills you. You're going to spend years, potentially the rest of your life, thinking and talking and writing about the subject of your book. I started writing about beavers in 2014, and I still, here we are 12 years later, and I still am constantly giving presentations and writing follow-up articles. When Nat Geo needs a beaver guy, right? Who do they call? The very public beaver guy, and that's fantastic, right? That's a great gift. But the topic has to excite you enough, I think, to be willing to continue thinking about it for many, many years. So once you have come up with a book idea and looked into the depths of your soul and said, you know what, I am still willing to talk about this thing 20 years from now, what do you do with that book idea? And there are a couple of routes. The first is pitching or proposing the idea directly to publishers. That's appropriate if you're working with academic presses or small presses, like let's say Island Press or Timber Press, which take unagented manuscripts. And maybe you're an academic, and that having a book in an academic press is a feather in your cap, and you don't really care if 400 copies are sold. That's a totally viable route that publishes lots of great books. I think that the route that you guys probably want to go is to publish with a major publisher, right? Simon & Schuster or HarperCollins or Penguin Random House or Norton, and that really requires contracting with a literary agent. Again, I think that's a route that you at least want to explore, because again, if you want to end up at a major publisher, they just don't take unagented manuscripts. And so you really want to find yourself an agent when you're ready for it. So where do agents come from? How do you accomplish that? A couple of places. One is just direct connections, right? The little nepotistic, insular world of science journalism is an endless source of hookups for other science journalists. So it's great that you guys are going to SEJ and presumably NASW and other conferences, do the good networking thing, right? That's where my agent came from. She was originally referred to me by Craig Welch, who's a great writer for Nat Geo and Seattle Times and other places. The other classic way of landing an agent that I have friends for whom this has worked is reading the acknowledgments of books that are similar to the one that you conceive, right? Because the writer always mentions their agent in the acknowledgments, and then you can reach out and say, hey, you represented this wonderful book, by Mary Roach that's a lot like the one that I conceive of. I think you should take me on as your client. The third route that I don't mention here is that often agents will actually approach you, right? If you write some great long-form feature in Harper's, let's say, an agent might read that and reach out and say, hey, you may not have a book idea today, but I see a lot of potential in you. I want to sign you as a client. If 3 years from now you have a great book idea, I will represent you. So agents are proactively reaching out to writers on their own, and I certainly know people for whom that's happened. So once you have your agent and you are going to work together on a book proposal. And that's a document that's typically 40 or 50 pages, let's say. The elements are typically an introduction, some kind of synopsis where you describe the book that you intend to write, a table of contents, really an expanded table of contents where you describe each chapter that you anticipate over the course of, let's say, several paragraphs. Publishers will not hold you to those chapters. All of my books have changed dramatically from proposal to publication, but you just want to demonstrate that you understand the scope or the arc of the project that you're proposing. You'll typically include a sample chapter that's generally going to be adapted from a previous story you've done. You're going to include some kind of about the author section where you describe all of your wonderful accomplishments. Somebody. Sorry. No, all good. You'll include a market analysis and a publicity plan. Those things, the market analysis is basically where you say, here are all of the wildly successful books by, Elizabeth Kolbert and David Quammen and David Haskell and all these great writers that are just like mine, and mine is going to be equally successful, right? Your comp titles, in your market analysis, your similar books that that yours resembles. You're not choosing some 800 copy selling press in an academic setting, right? You're choosing, another big award-winning bestseller. Give the publisher something to dream on. And your publicity plan is basically, here are all the podcasts I'm going to go on. Here are the conferences I'm going to speak at. Here's how I'm going to get this book out there. Obviously, your publisher, is going to have their own ideas, but you're an active participant, and you want to demonstrate that you have those connections and ideas as well. And your agent will help you with all of this. It's very much a collaborative document between you and your agent. And again, if this sounds daunting, it is, right? It takes months to write a good book proposal, which again, you're writing without any guarantee that it will sell. So it's an arduous process, but ultimately, this is going to be the backbone of your book, right? Once you've done the proposal, you've got a chapter in the bag, you've got your intro in the bag, you've got your reporting plan in the form of your table of contents, you know where you're going to go and who you're going to talk to, at least in theory. So it's a lot of work up front, but once you've done it, you really are in a much better position to write your book. So once you and your agent have collaborated on creating the book proposal, what does she do with it? A couple of possible routes. One is submitting to a single editor, right? She says, this is absolutely perfect for this editor at Milkweed Press, who I know. I know she's going to love it. I'm going to give her first crack at it, and hopefully she'll come back with a viable offer. The other route is going to auction, where the agent basically sends the proposal out to a bunch of different publishers, says, give me your best offer, and then there's, a little, typically 48-hour or so bidding war, which was the most exciting 2 days of my life, and then everything else was anticlimax after that. But it was really fun to get these offers from various houses and kind of play them off each other a little bit, which is all my agent's job. I wasn't, I was just kind of fielding the offers as they came in. But it was very exciting. It's one of the rare times that you as a writer feel wanted by the world. Keep in mind, of course, that your agent works for you. If in the course of selling your book, you talk to a few editors at various publishing houses, and you get, great vibes from one and less great vibes from another, you, of course, this is your book and your life and your career, and you can say to your agent, you know what, I love this person, didn't love this person, all things being equal, I want to end up at this house. You have that latitude to express your desires. Your agent gets 15%. That's standard across the industry, and she'll definitely earn it for you. How long does writing a book take, and when do you get paid? You've signed the contract. Typically, the contract calls for a completed manuscript in something like 1 to 2 years. But there's a lot of flexibility there, much more so than with magazine writing, in my experience. I think editors are generally very understanding that life happens. The reporting ends up being much more complicated than you anticipated. You have a kid, in my case, and you ask for, let's say, 6 more months, and that's totally fine, as long as you provide enough advance notice. So how do you get paid? You get paid in advance, right? And I think people hear the term advance and think, oh, great, I'm getting this big chunk of money up front. But you guys are all sophisticated master students. That's not how it works, right? And the word advance really refers to an advance against royalties, meaning that you have to earn enough royalties for your book to essentially earn out, to make back that money that you were paid as the advance before you start getting more money, right? You just have to basically sell a bunch of copies in order to get paid more than what your publisher initially gives you. And that advance is split into 3, and I think more typically now 4 installments, and that's generally 1 when you sign the contract, 1 when the manuscript is accepted for completion, 1 when the book is published, and then 1 a year after publication, or maybe when the paperback comes out. So suffice to say, let's say your advance is $100,000, which would be a really good advance for a debut nonfiction writer. Well, that sounds like a big chunk of money, but you're probably getting $30,000 or so when you sign that contract, and then that money, basically has to sustain you for the 2 years or so it takes to complete the book, right, along with whatever other freelancing you're doing. So and then of course your agent takes 15% in taxes, etc. We return to the dubious economics of authorship, right? You're really not getting a lot of money up front, and you're doing a lot of work before you're compensated for that work. And again, the royalties come into play when your book earns out, right? When you sell enough copies, to have earned back that advance. Your book probably will not earn out. I've read that 80% of trade nonfiction doesn't. I'm not sure how true that is, but that's certainly a possibility. I've got 1 book that earned out, and 1 that probably never will, and that's fine. Again, that's what publishers expect of most books in my understanding. How do you actually do this thing? How do you write a book? Again, this is just one person's perspective, but a few things that have worked for me is setting micro deadlines for yourself, right? You sign the contract, and the thought of turning in 80,000 words 2 years from now just feels like this impossibly long time period and an impossibly large amount of writing. So just break it down. Say, hey, okay, if I have to turn in 80,000 words in 2 years, how many words do I have to write a month to get there, a week to get there, a day to get there, right? I do things like say, okay, I need 300 words today to basically maintain my forward momentum. And so setting those little deadlines and abiding by them, I think, is helpful. I love to write as I report, not afterward, right? Just, again, to maintain forward momentum and feel like I'm getting words down on the page. I've turned in a first draft of my most recent book, and I still have reporting to do, and that's fine. Again, just keep moving forward at all costs. Like a mako shark who has to swim to survive. My biggest regret with Crossings, with my last book, is that I spent hours and hours, untold hours, finessing the transitions between chapters, and then I submitted a draft to my editor who said, okay, all of these chapters are in the wrong place, and all of those transitions were worthless, right? So just get things down, especially with that first draft. Don't go too crazy. This is going to be a collaborative process with your editor. Just keep moving. Obviously, every word that you write, and this goes for all kinds of writing, make sure that they are being saved in a document somewhere. You're going to use them someday in the form of magazine stories or op-eds when it comes time to promote your book. Going from first draft to final draft of Crossings, I lost 35,000 words, a novella basically. But probably half of that has been published in other forms. Residencies and fellowships are going to help you a lot, again, because, the economics of book writing are dubious, especially with a debut, especially as you get going, it's really helpful to find, those grants and residencies and other sources of funding. I've benefited a lot from Alicia Patterson Foundation money and from Whiting Foundation money. I'm sure Dan has you plugged into all of the databases where those grants and fellowships and opportunities are compiled. But look for opportunities to keep some money rolling in, and you also need actual friends. And I know that Christy Ashwanden talked about this when she was here. But finding your writing community. I'm in a couple of Slack and WhatsApp groups with other authors where we're talking about our progress and complaining about our publishers and doing all of the fun things that writers do. So make sure you're finding community with other writers, other book writers especially. Once you've finished your book, you wait for a year, typically, between completion and publication, which is the most agonizing year of your life. But make sure in that interval you're starting the promotion process, right? You cannot begin promoting your book too early. Even as you're writing, you should have a Google Doc or an Excel spreadsheet where you're keeping track of, podcasts you're going to go on and potential reviewers and blurbers and all of that stuff. Book promotion, this is again a constantly shifting landscape. I think a year or two ago you'd have said that like having a TikTok is mandatory. Now TikTok is basically irrelevant, to nonfiction. So again, the book promotion tectonic plates are constantly sliding. But a few evergreen forms of promotion, I think, of course, excerpts, right? You're going to be looking to place a chunk or potentially several chunks of your books in magazines and on digital platforms and so on. So getting those samples out there, and again, thinking about the very long publication timetables that magazines have is important here, right? If you want to get an excerpt in the New Yorker, you better be thinking about that a year out from publication. Obviously, book reviews and reviewers, of course, those opportunities are increasingly scarce. So that, by the time you guys are ready to publish your own books, there may be no book reviewers in the United States, but right now, that's one way to get your book out there. Doing in-person events, of course, book talks, audio, radio, and podcast, blasting out your emails to every single person basically becoming a digital spammer for a couple months there. Obviously using your social media. You guys are all much savvier about that undoubtedly than I am, so I'll let you fill in the blanks there. And also being creative, I think is really helpful, right? Everybody's getting hit constantly by book events and podcasts and reviews and so on. So what can you do to make your book stand out? When I published my first book about beavers, I did this little promotion where every person who pre-ordered a copy got a beaver chewed stick that I had collected during my reporting travel. So I sent hundreds and hundreds of sticks to people across the country, and I certainly lost money doing it, right? But it got the book in front of a lot of people, and I think was really effective. So what can you do to make your book promotion unique? And again, your publisher is going to help with all this. They're going to know their people, and they're going to have an email contact for Terry Gross's producer, right? But increasingly, I think you have to be your own best advocate. I think that publishers especially are. Well, I think they're allocating more resources, towards their celebrity memoirists and their romantasy novelists, and for you as a fledgling nonfiction writer, it's really easy to get lost in the shuffle. You have to be your own best advocate, put your own best foot forward, and really help out there. What does it mean for a book to succeed? Who knows? The data is flawed and incomplete. Success, whatever success means is stochastic, meaning it's basically random. Your book gets read by the right Instagram influencer, and suddenly there are 1,000 pre-orders. A lot of that you just can't control, and book promotion I think is an exercise in surrendering control. this is true of all writing. Comparison is the thief of joy, but there are going to be writers out there who do better than you, whose books are nominated for awards that yours are not nominated for, who crack bestseller lists that you do not make. That is going to be a pain, and yet you have to just surrender that and run your own race. And I think that's true of life. Don't read the Goodreads or Amazon reviews ever. And then finally, reader interactions will sustain you, right? And that's the one of the really beautiful things about writing a book is that you will be giving a talk at Powell someday, and some reader will come up to you and say, hey, I read your book and it was my favorite book ever, and I gave a copy to my dying grandmother. I've just had more meaningful reader interactions than I can count. And I think, again, books do that in a way that other forms of media don't always. And again, to return to the point about about the cultural weight of books. Books have long tails. They're these artifacts that, again, live on people's shelves and are given as gifts for birthdays and the holidays. They have this weight of authority by virtue of their physical heft. And, I think that as a result, they have the power to move culture and policy and people's thought patterns in a way that, again, in my experience, other media forms don't. I've published hundreds and hundreds of articles. I could not tell you a single concrete thing that they have accomplished in the world. My books they've changed laws, they've changed regulations. There have been, millions and millions of dollars in grant funding allocated to various projects because the right rich person happened to read one. I once got an email from a couple in Boston who sold their house and moved to a house on a beaver pond because they had read Eager, my beaver book, and wanted to live amongst the beavers. That is the kind of random but incredibly fulfilling thing that books are capable of accomplishing. And that's why I love them beyond all other media. So with that, I'll take a breath, and I'm looking forward to talking to Anna and also fielding your questions as well.
I'm so inspired. I would love to go back to your first book and talk a little bit more in depth about how it came together. Yeah. I know that it started as an article, and so I'm curious, really, like you write this article about beavers, yeah. And at what point in that writing process did you go, this could really be something?
Yeah, so the story of Eager, my first book, is really incredibly serendipitous. My first job in journalism was I worked for the magazine High Country News, which is based out in Colorado and covers environmental issues throughout the American West. And if you have Western stories, they're just fantastic. It's just a fantastic magazine for young writers to break into. So I was a fellow there, and then I became a staff writer, a correspondent, as they called it at the time, living in Seattle, looking for things to cover. I was on this, kind of monthly word count contract, and somebody sent me this, flyer for a beaver workshop, and I didn't know what that was, but it sounded like it could be a story, and then it ended up changing my life. So I wrote that story about this kind of groundswell of beaver philia in the Northwest, and then again, incredibly serendipitously, this publisher, Chelsea Green Publishing, based in Vermont, small publisher, reached out and said, "Hey, we've identified this growing national interest in beavers. We want to do a beaver book. We scoured the internet and we liked your beaver story. And would you be interested in writing a book?" I was really interested, in part because when I was working on the story, probably 6 months earlier, I had felt like there was this kind of greater literary potential there, right? Again, a story about beavers was also a story about climate change and the transformation of the North American landscape and the history of capitalism. But, I just didn't know how to go about writing a book, what to do with that idea. And so it, kind of fell into my lap. I was really fortunate, I was unagented. And they didn't provide any kind of, guidance, really. They just said, like, hey, book about beavers, come back in 18 months, go, with, a very small advance in the low 5 figures. And that was just this incredible stroke of luck.
Wow, that is incredible. So, like, you were still, when you wrote that article in, I think what you called the the dilettante phase,
Yeah, yeah.
right? And so over the 18 months, there was probably kind of the risk that you, did that work? Okay. There's probably kind of the risk that you would go, actually, I'm not interested in this, but it ended up holding your interest for the long haul.
It did, yeah, and it's funny when that opportunity
Yeah.
fell into my lap. I talked to a couple of my my writing mentors. Sue Halpern being one of them, who's a great reporter and author, and Sue basically gave me a piece of advice that I included in this presentation, which is is this topic going to sustain your interest for many, many years to come? And I think that that Sue probably rightly was skeptical that it would. She was not exactly cautioning me against taking this on, but saying, search your soul, before you say yes to this.
Right.
And I did, and I just felt like there was so much to say about these goofy little rodents.
How much, maybe looking ahead to your second book, how much for this group, since these are people who are potentially going to be freelancers, how much actual magazine freelance work were you doing at the same time as writing your second book?
Yeah, I was doing a lot. I mean, I was still under
Yeah.
contract for HCN as I was working on Eager, because again it was just it was I mean, I think I got $4,000 up front or something like that, and so of course you have to do other work. I was also in this sort of transitional time in my life where I think that like my wife was like working as a camp nurse at a summer camp, and so we didn't have rent to pay, and I was basically driving around the American West, living out of my car, driving from Beaver Pond to Beaver Pond, essentially, and so our expenses were low, but yeah, it was definitely this. It was definitely kind of a hustle at that point.
Yeah, how did you manage it though? Like I could see that being very difficult to have your attention really sort of torn between this like long-term project that might end up being sort of like your passion, your baby, and then the stuff that you're having to do in a more kind of week-to-week way.
Yeah, I think that week-to-week stuff is actually really important to have those smaller timeline projects, because again, writing a book is this incredibly long, arduous experience, and you can just feel so bogged down in it, and in the middle of all that, it feels great to just toss off 800 words in 6 hours and be done with it, right? And also I think it's important too to just keep getting your name out there. There are times when I'm working on a book, and I'm not publishing much in the way of stories, where I feel like every editor I ever knew has forgotten that I exist, and just doing a little bit of work, to keep some income rolling in, and also to just keep your name out there. Remind your editors and your colleagues and your community that yes, you are still a human being. You haven't crawled up in a hole somewhere.
Yeah. This brings me to my next question, which is about self-promotion, which I'm really glad you talked about in your presentation, because I think it's often a really overlooked thing. Like, I don't know, I don't know you well, but you seem like a fairly social, outgoing guy. Not every science journalist is. And I'm curious, like, how, for somebody who is maybe less that way, how the promotional aspect can still be managed for a book.
That's a good question. Look, I think that being able to hide behind, maybe not hide behind, but to shelter in your topic and the expertise that you've developed is a big part of it. I do lots of events, and I really enjoy them. I love talking about the subjects of my books. I don't, I mean, this is like a rare thing where I talk about myself a little bit, but I generally don't do that, because I actually think that the subjects, the topics, or the stories, are much more interesting than I am. And in my experience, I think that even lots of writers who are not necessarily gregarious or comfortable talking about themselves, can still take pleasure in sharing the incredible stories they collected in the process of writing their books, right? You can kind of hide behind the subject matter, foreground the work itself, and recede yourself a little bit.
Yeah, that's smart. It also, just on the same promotion note, if TikTok is irrelevant now, what is relevant?
If you find out, Anna, please let me know. I don't know. It is an incredibly challenging landscape for book promotion. As you all know, the WAPO, right, just folded their books coverage. There are fewer reviewers than ever. NPR shows don't cover books as frequently and as intensively as they used to. I think that obviously there are lots of new book promotion media out there. I've done 1 million podcasts. I'm not totally convinced that podcasts sell many books. I often feel like, especially the long form conversational podcasts that are in vogue now, I often feel like at the end of an hour-long conversation, I've kind of given most of the book away. I'm not sure that there's much there to tickle the reader's imagination anymore. So I'm not sure that podcasts sell books. So there are a million ways to get the word about your book out there. The question is, do those convert to sales? And I honestly don't know. I feel like we're in this, kind of dramatically changing landscape for book sales and promotion right now.